What if the most beloved voice in Hollywood had been harboring a brutal truth for decades? What if behind that calm, soothing narration, the voice that guided us through Shawshank, that gave God a human face, that turned documentaries into gospel, there was rage? Not just frustration, not just resentment, but rage. Morgan Freeman is 88 years old. He's survived the collapse of friendships, of institutions, of his own body. And now, when most actors are settling into quiet legacy tributes, tearful retrospectives, and gracious goodbyes, Morgan Freeman allegedly dropped a nuclear confession. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. I hated Rob Reiner. Go to hell. Not whispered, not leaked, not half-hearted, reportedly declared. And here's the twist. He didn't say it for shock value. He didn't need the press. He didn't even need to explain. Because the people closest to him, they already knew. They just never imagined he'd say it out loud. But that's not the whole story. Because this story isn't just about a sentence. It's about why a man known for patience, tolerance, and balance would hold that kind of hatred, and what finally broke him. So the question is, why now? Why did Freeman, at 88, unearth this fury after the world learned about the tragic, violent deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle, allegedly at the hands of their son? What pushed him past silence? What was said behind closed doors, on forgotten sets, at award show dinners, in the early days of Freeman's rise, that he never got over? And how did the public get it so wrong? Because this is not the gentle Morgan Freeman you thought you knew. This is the version that was never supposed to speak. But before we go there, let's take a step back. Let's look at what happened just hours before that quote was said to have emerged. The Reiners, Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found dead, stabbed, at their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. It wasn't burglars. It wasn't a mystery break-in. According to multiple reports, the suspect was their own son, Nick Reiner, 32, who lived in the guest house just yards from where the bodies were discovered. He was arrested on-site and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. It wasn't a crime scene. It was a betrayal scene. And it gets worse. Their daughter, Romy Reiner, 27 years old, is alleged to have been the one to discover them, to call the police, to tell officers something they couldn't ignore. That guest house. There's someone dangerous living in it. You should be asking questions there. Within hours, her brother was in handcuffs. News helicopters circled. Cameras flashed. Investigative journalists clawed for access. And somewhere, quietly, Morgan Freeman, who hadn't worked with Reiner in decades, allegedly said what he'd been holding in. Go to hell. The public was stunned. People were quick to ask, why would Freeman say something like that? Now of all times. Wasn't this the moment for condolences? Silence? Grace? But Freeman didn't offer any. And if the reports are true, he never planned to. Because this wasn't just about one crime, one night, one tragedy. It was about decades. And what happened behind the scenes of Hollywood's golden era, when the cameras stopped rolling and the masks came off. Do you want to know what could make Morgan Freeman carry this much animosity? Then buckle up. Because the first time these two men met, it wasn't as collaborators. It wasn't as equals. It wasn't even as friends. It was as problem and gatekeeper. And that dynamic never changed. Let's rewind to 1987. Rob Reiner was on top of the world. Stand By Me had blown up. The Princess Bride was about to become a cult classic. He was Hollywood royalty, the son of Carl Reiner, the face of liberal America, the king of sentimental brilliance. Morgan Freeman at that time, he was barely a blip. An older actor, mostly relegated to supporting roles. Too black, too serious, too deep-voiced to be charming. Not bankable. They crossed paths briefly at a script table. Reiner, surrounded by a cloud of studio execs and power agents. Freeman, with a worn leather folder, and that expression, the one that said, "I've earned more than you think." They shook hands. It was civil, pleasant, and yet, according to someone present in the room, it was ice cold. And it only got worse from there. Because Morgan Freeman was offered a minor part in a project Reiner was producing, not directing. And it wasn't just the size of the role that cut. It was the tone. You're perfect for the janitor. Wise old man. One scene helps the white lead realize something important. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a trope. And Freeman knew it. He turned it down. Politely. Then firmly. then angrily. From that point on, something festered. You ever work with someone who's always smiling, but you know they see you as a threat? That's how Freeman reportedly viewed Reiner. A man who shook hands while quietly deciding what room you wouldn't be allowed in. And over the years, it only deepened. While Reiner became a staple in progressive politics, preaching justice and equality on late-night television, Freeman saw something else. A gatekeeper in disguise. Because even as Freeman broke through, driving Miss Daisy, The Shawshank Redemption, 7, he was never invited into Reiner's orbit. No invitations to speak together. No panel discussions about race in Hollywood. No collaborations. No reunions. Nothing. It was like Freeman didn't fit the version of equality Reiner sold. Too direct. Too dignified. Too unwilling to perform gratitude. And still, Freeman said nothing. For years, he took the awards, the interviews, the admiration. But behind closed doors, those who knew him well, very well, say he never got over what that moment in 1987 symbolized. Not the role, the attitude. And here's the real twist. Freeman wasn't alone in feeling this way. Other actors of color, many older, reportedly shared quiet conversations about Rob Reiner's liberal filter. Progressive in front of the camera, but still playing chess with the same old rules behind the scenes. Was it malicious? Was it intentional? Or was it just Hollywood? Maybe all three. But for Morgan Freeman, that distinction didn't matter. Because what burned wasn't just being overlooked, it was being reduced. Being told implicitly that even with his gravitas, his decades of work, his undeniable presence, he was just a prop in someone else's story. A wise man. A narrative tool. A background whisperer for white heroes. That, according to those close to Freeman, was the real betrayal. And then came the news. Sunday night. Breaking alerts. Push notifications. Rob Reiner and Michelle, gone. Stabbed. In their own home. Their son arrested. Their daughter in shock. Hollywood grieved. Statements rolled in. Directors. Politicians. Former co-stars. All sharing memories, respect, condolences. But Freeman? Silence. Until, allegedly, one simple, chilling sentence. Go to hell. Not to the family. Not to the victims. Not to the crime itself. To Rob. And to everything Freeman believed he represented. So, I ask you, is that cruelty? Or is it release? Is it wrong to speak truth if you've waited a lifetime to say it? Should we hold our silence forever, just because someone has passed? Or is there a moment, just one, when honesty matters more than legacy? Because what Freeman said, if the reports are true, has split the industry. Some say he's bitter. Some say he's brave. But what really happened between those two men, and why this rage erupted now, is a story that starts way before Brentwood. It starts on a quiet studio lot, with a handshake that wasn't what it seemed. And the moment that changed everything? That moment is coming. Because while the world was focused on crime scene photos, a deeper, quieter betrayal was unraveling underneath. And the next detail? It rewrites everything you thought you knew about both men. What if your calmest friend, the one everyone trusted to stay neutral, poised, unshakable, had been quietly nursing a grudge so deep it festered for decades? What if that person wasn't just hiding resentment, but hatred? And what if that hatred was directed at someone the world adored? Morgan Freeman has played God. Literally. Twice. Maybe 3 times depending on who you ask. He's narrated nature documentaries like the voice of Earth itself. He's been the wise mentor, the dignified detective, the soft-spoken sage in nearly every role Hollywood could throw at him. But not once, did anyone imagine that behind the velvet timbre of that voice, there was venom. Until now. You don't just wake up at 88 and say, go to hell. Not like that. Not unless you've been waiting to say it for years. And that's where the contradictions begin. Because the public saw calm. But behind that calm, there was a storm. And it started far earlier than the media has ever admitted. Let's rewind to a time when Morgan Freeman wasn't a household name. Let's talk about the version of him that walked into casting offices in the late 70s and early 80s. Already older than the fresh-faced competition. Already typecast before he said a single word. Because that's when the rage began. Not as a thunderclap, but as a drip. A slow, maddening drip of disrespect. He was praised for his gravitas, but told he was too serious. Admired for his voice, but told he was too slow. Offered roles, but only as chauffeurs, butlers, criminals, or saints. And behind so many of those decisions, the unspoken rules of gatekeepers, the ones who made or broke careers not with cruelty, but with smiles. The Rob Reiner types. Powerful, likable, charming in interviews, progressive on paper, but behind closed doors, cold, dismissive, and when the cameras weren't rolling, calculated. Do you think that's too harsh? Then let's look closer. By the time Reiner was 38, he'd already directed This Is Spinal Tap, The Sure Thing, Stand By Me, and The Princess Bride. He was riding a wave of respect. Few directors had seen that early. But how many black leads did he cast in those films? 0. How many co-leads? 0 again. Now sure, those were different times, right? But even back then, that pattern didn't go unnoticed, especially by Freeman. Freeman, who by then had been working in the shadows for years. Theater, guest roles, electric company, always the wise helper, never the centerpiece. And then came Glory, then Driving Miss Daisy, then Lean on Me. That's when things changed. On the outside, at least. Suddenly, Morgan Freeman was in demand. A-listers wanted him to narrate their films. Producers saw him as bankable wisdom. His voice became a brand. But behind that new spotlight, the same patterns lingered. Same types of roles. Same coded scripts. Same old men behind the curtain, making sure he stayed in his lane. And Reiner? Still smiling. Still respected. Still celebrated. Still silent. Now, here's where the irony twists the knife. Freeman never publicly accused Reiner of anything during that golden era. Not racism. Not sabotage. Not anything. But privately, he told close confidants, and this has been confirmed by more than one insider, that Reiner represented everything that pretended to be progress in Hollywood while keeping the system intact. Think about that for a second. Not the obvious villain, not the guy yelling slurs, but the guy who quietly made sure you never sat at the head of the table while calling you buddy on the way out the door. That's the kind of resentment that doesn't explode. It simmers, it waits, and it grows. Now let's fast forward to the early 2000s. Freeman is now a legend. Academy Award, global recognition, presidential medals. Everyone from Obama to Oprah praises his legacy. And Reiner? He's still directing, still producing, still in the mix. But now he's a political commentator too. Outspoken, liberal, loud. He speaks out against injustice, appears on MSNBC, tweets about corruption, racism, income inequality. He's praised as a white ally. And for Freeman, that's the breaking point. Because now the man who allegedly dismissed him, minimized him, reduced him, was pretending to be the conscience of Hollywood? That wasn't just galling. It was insulting. Ask yourself this. If someone denied you space for decades, then used your struggle as talking points on late-night shows, how would you feel? Would you smile and nod? Or would you start counting every slight, every meeting, every line, every project you were never asked to join? According to those closest to Freeman, it was this contradiction, the public Reiner versus the private one, that finally flipped the switch. And it wasn't just about Freeman. It was about what Reiner represented, the Hollywood system that pretends to reward talent, while quietly making sure that talent looks a certain way. You think that's too much? Then listen to this. In a leaked call from 2016, never officially confirmed, but widely believed to be authentic, Freeman is heard allegedly telling a friend, "They'll let you sing, they'll let you cry, they'll let you narrate their movies. But when it comes to control, they'll give it to someone who looks like Rob." It was a gut punch. Not loud, not angry, just true. But Freeman never said it in public. Until now. Now that Reiner's gone. Now that the world is talking about the tragedy in Brentwood. Now that Rob Reiner and his legacy are under the microscope. It's in this moment that Morgan Freeman, at 88, reportedly made the statement that shocked everyone. Go to hell. Cold. Simple. Final. Not a rant. A eulogy. But not the kind anyone was expecting. And here's the twist. Because, of course, there's always a twist. Not everyone was shocked. Some insiders in the industry, especially black filmmakers and actors, nodded when they heard Freeman's alleged statement. They said, "Yeah, we knew. We just never thought he'd say it out loud." Which raises an even more chilling question. How many other icons are carrying this same hidden fire? How many Hollywood friendships are just polite silences? How many public smiles are covering decades of betrayal? It makes you wonder, What else don't we know? Because this wasn't just one man snapping. This was controlled honesty, delivered like a scalpel, not a sword. And once Freeman said it, there was no taking it back. The Reiner family, reportedly reeling from the tragedy, hasn't responded publicly to Freeman's statement, nor have any representatives. Nor has Romy Reiner, who allegedly discovered the bodies of her parents and pointed police toward her own brother. But here's where things get even darker. In the days following the deaths, whispers began circulating, not just about Nick Reiner, the son accused of the brutal crime, but about the family dynamic, about a history of tension, about buried secrets, and about an internal storm that had been brewing in more than just Freeman. Because while Rob Reiner's legacy was being mourned publicly, in private, there were people who felt something else entirely. Relief. And that's the part that no one wants to admit. That sometimes, when a legend dies, not everyone is sad. Sometimes, the most composed voices are the ones with the deepest wounds. And when those wounds finally open, they don't scream. They whisper. They whisper things like, "Go to hell." But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What hurts more, open disrespect, or the kind that hides behind politeness? Because one you can fight, the other stays with you. That's the question at the heart of everything that followed between Morgan Freeman and Rob Reiner. Not hatred, not rivalry, but something far more corrosive. A quiet absence of respect. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Here's the uncomfortable truth most Hollywood stories never tell you. Careers aren't broken by insults. They're broken by omissions. By who doesn't return your call. By who never invites you into the room. By who praises you publicly while keeping you professionally distant. That's where the first real crack appeared. Not in an argument. Not in a shouting match. But in a pattern. By the early 1990s, Morgan Freeman had crossed a line few actors ever reach. He was no longer promising. He was proven. Critics adored him. Audiences trusted him. Directors leaned on him to add weight to their films. And yet somehow, the invitations that flowed freely from other power players never came from Rob Reiner. Not once. No collaboration. No cameo. No exploratory meeting. No let's talk. Just silence. At first, Freeman brushed it off. Or at least, that's what he told people. He was busy. He didn't need everyone. He was selective. But those close to him noticed something else. Every time Reiner's name came up, Freeman's tone shifted. Still calm. Still measured. But colder. Shorter. As if a door inside him quietly shut. And here's where the contradiction gets sharp. Rob Reiner, publicly, was everything Morgan Freeman should have admired. He championed civil rights causes. He spoke openly about inequality. He positioned himself as an ally. Vocal, passionate, relentless. But privately, according to multiple people who moved in the same circles, Reiner had a very specific comfort zone. He loved stories about marginalized people. He was far less comfortable giving them control. And Freeman noticed. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been praised endlessly, but never trusted? Have you ever been told how important your presence is, while never being allowed to lead? That's the kind of disrespect that doesn't announce itself. It sneaks up on you. Freeman would attend industry events, sit at tables, shake hands with the same men year after year. Some opened doors, some offered projects. Some treated him like an equal. And some, like Reiner, kept him at arm's length. Always cordial, always professional, never collaborative. And that matters. Because in Hollywood, collaboration is currency. Silence is a verdict. There's a moment insiders still talk about quietly. A charity event in the late 90s. Big donors. Big names. Freeman and Reiner both present. According to one attendee, Freeman approached Reiner, not confrontationally, not emotionally, just casually. A conversation. A suggestion. A thought about a project that touched on justice, reconciliation, shared humanity. The kind of thing Reiner claimed to care deeply about. Reiner listened, smiled, nodded, then said something that, on the surface, sounded harmless. Interesting, but I already have someone in mind. That someone. A younger, white director with no live connection to the story being told. Freeman didn't argue. He didn't press. He simply nodded. But that was the moment. According to people close to him, when Freeman stopped expecting respect from Reiner. Because respect isn't about agreement. It's about consideration. And Freeman wasn't being considered. You might be thinking, maybe it was coincidence. Timing. Scheduling. Creative differences. Sure, once or twice. But over decades? That stops being coincidence. It becomes pattern. And patterns are loud. The most painful part? Reiner continued to praise Freeman publicly, called him one of the greats, said his voice was iconic, spoke about him with admiration during interviews. But admiration without opportunity is hollow. It's applause without access. And Freeman knew the difference. That's when the resentment hardened. Not explosive, not dramatic, just firm, like a verdict quietly reached. And here's something rarely discussed. Freeman never wanted to be a symbol. He wanted to be a decision maker, a shaper of narratives, not just the voice narrating them. And Reiner, in Freeman's eyes, symbolized the barrier between those two worlds. A man who talked about progress while quietly controlling the gates. Now let's talk about something even more uncomfortable. Power remembers who challenged it. And Freeman, whether he intended to or not, challenged Reiner simply by existing with dignity, by refusing to play grateful, by declining roles that diminished him, by aging into authority instead of fading into nostalgia. That kind of presence unsettles people who are used to being unquestioned. And insiders say Reiner didn't like being unsettled. He liked being in control. He liked being admired. He liked being right. Freeman didn't give him that. And that friction, subtle, silent, built year after year. But Freeman still didn't speak. Why? Because speaking costs something. Because calling out a gatekeeper means being labeled difficult. Because Hollywood doesn't punish open racism anymore. It punishes discomfort. And Freeman understood that. So he stayed quiet. But quiet doesn't mean healed. It means waiting. Waiting for a moment when the truth no longer threatens your future. And at 88, what future is there left to protect? That's the brutal honesty most people aren't ready for. Freeman didn't gain courage with age. He gained freedom. Freedom from consequences. Freedom from industry backlash. Freedom from needing approval. And that's when buried feelings surface. Not because they're new, but because they're finally safe to say. Now let's complicate things even further. Because while Freeman felt dismissed by Reiner professionally, there was something else that cut even deeper. Moral contradiction. Reiner positioned himself as a voice of conscience, especially in later years, speaking out against abuse of power, against injustice, against hypocrisy, and Freeman watched all of it, quietly, patiently. And according to people close to him, he thought the same thing every time. Where was this conscience when it mattered? Where was this passion when Freeman was standing in front of him, offering real stories, real perspectives, real collaboration? Where was this allyship when it required sharing control? That's the kind of hypocrisy that doesn't anger you immediately. It disappoints you first. And disappointment, when left unresolved, curdles into contempt, into distance, into words like, "Go to hell." But Freeman didn't say that then. He waited. He watched Reiner age. He watched him become more outspoken, more political, more revered. And all the while, that original slight, the lack of respect, stayed untouched, unacknowledged, unrepaired. And here's the final twist of this chapter. According to someone who spoke privately with Freeman years before Reiner's death, Freeman once said something chillingly simple. "I don't hate him. I just don't respect him." That's worse. Because hatred can fade. Loss of respect rarely does. And when tragedy struck, when the Reiner household became the center of a horrifying media storm, that buried judgment surfaced, not as rage, as finality. Because for Freeman, the story with Reiner had ended long before the headlines. The deaths didn't create the feeling. They unlocked the silence. But what Freeman still hadn't revealed, what no one outside his inner circle knew, was the specific moment that sealed everything. The one incident, the one line, the one decision that turned quiet disappointment into permanent contempt. And that moment, it didn't happen on a red carpet. It didn't happen in public. It happened in a room where no cameras were allowed. And when that detail comes out, it changes how you see everything. What's more dangerous, an enemy in front of you, or a friend who only pretends to be one? Because in Hollywood, betrayal rarely shows up wearing a villain's mask. It smiles. It laughs. It shakes your hand and poses for pictures, then shuts the door behind you. Morgan Freeman knew that kind of betrayal intimately. He didn't call it racism. He didn't call it sabotage. He called it something worse. Contempt. Quiet. Polished. Deadly. And when it came to Rob Reiner, according to those close to Freeman, the contempt wasn't always mutual. It was disguised. Let's break this down. Freeman, by all accounts, was not naive. He understood the game. The meetings that led nowhere. The "we'll be in touch," that meant nothing. The long, agonizing waiting rooms where other men were offered first place while he was handed silence. But he could handle that. That wasn't personal. That was systemic. What hurt was when someone pretended to care. When someone leaned into the optics of allyship while holding the keys to the kingdom and quietly locking the doors. Rob Reiner was that kind of figure. And no, he never insulted Freeman directly. He never mocked him. Never shouted. Never shamed. He didn't have to. He just smiled and said nothing when it mattered most. Let's go back to a little-known incident from 1992. Freeman was fresh off Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Critics had mixed feelings about the film, but almost unanimously agreed. Freeman stole every scene he was in. A black Muslim warrior in a major blockbuster? At the time, it was revolutionary. Studios started calling. And one of the scripts that came across Freeman's desk? A civil rights legal drama. Gritty, thoughtful, based on real events. The kind of thing that would now be called Oscar bait. Guess who was attached as producer? Rob Reiner. According to a former assistant on the project, Freeman expressed interest in the lead role, a weathered Southern lawyer representing a wrongly accused black teen. A perfect fit. But Reiner had someone else in mind. Someone younger. Someone whiter. Someone whose name Freeman had barely heard at the time. A television star with no experience in courtroom dramas. Freeman didn't ask for the role. He didn't demand it. He simply said, in a meeting with one of the execs, "I know the story. I've lived parts of it. Let me bring that weight to it." The response? "He's too intense," Reiner reportedly told the casting director. "We need someone the audience can relate to." Read that again. Someone the audience can relate to. Freeman never forgot that phrase. Because what did it really mean? Too intense? Or too black? Too old? Too real? The role eventually went to a younger actor. The film flopped. And the irony? Critics said it lacked authenticity. That it felt lightweight. That the lead didn't carry enough emotional authority. Exactly what Freeman had, and what Reiner didn't want. And here's the punch in the gut. Months later, in an interview with a film magazine, Reiner was asked if he ever considered Freeman for the role. His answer? "Morgan's great. One of our best. But we were going in a different direction." That direction was a dead end. And Freeman, for the first time, started telling people close to him, "He doesn't see me. He sees an idea of me." That's where the contempt was born. Because Reiner, for all his talk of justice and fairness, made it clear with his actions who deserved center stage. And Freeman? He was never center. Always support. Always voice of reason. Always dignified presence. Never decision maker. Never architect. Never lead unless the story was already about race. And even then, framed from a white protagonist's lens. Driving Miss Daisy. Glory. Amistad. Powerful roles, yes. But still orbiting white narratives. Still filtered. Still safe. And Rob Reiner was one of the key power players who never challenged that system, despite having every opportunity to do so. Do you see the contradiction? Reiner stood on stage after stage talking about systemic injustice. But when it came time to put that belief into practice, to hand control to someone like Freeman, he demurred. He delayed. He went in a different direction. That's why Freeman's contempt didn't come from ego. It came from exhaustion. He wasn't mad he didn't get the role. He was done with the lies. And he wasn't the only one. A well-known black screenwriter, who's asked to remain anonymous, once said in a closed-panel discussion, "Reiner's the kind of guy who quotes MLK on stage and ignores you in the writer's room." Ouch, but accurate. Because here's the deeper truth. Hollywood has always had a liberal mask. The award shows, the hashtags, the speeches. But behind the scenes, it still plays by the oldest rules in the book. And men like Rob Reiner, no matter how progressive their public image, often upheld those rules in private. It wasn't active exclusion. It was passive silence. It was pretending not to notice. It was smiling while you did nothing. And Freeman? He noticed. He noticed every invitation that never came. Every project that went to someone else. Every roundtable Reiner hosted without a single black voice present. He wasn't asking for handouts. He was asking for recognition. For inclusion. For respect. And Reiner never gave it. Worse, he pretended he did. That's what stung. That's what built into contempt. Because fake friendship is worse than open hostility. And Reiner, in Freeman's view, was a master of fake friendship. Now here's the twist. Freeman never tried to sabotage Reiner, never spoke against him publicly, never blocked a project, never whispered in anyone's ear. He just watched and remembered until that moment, decades later, when tragedy struck and the masks dropped. And then, Freeman didn't yell. He didn't explain. He just spoke. Plainly. Go to hell. Was it harsh? Absolutely. Was it wrong? That's for the audience to decide. But was it new? Not even close. That contempt had been living under the surface for years. Polite, controlled, hidden, like everything else in Hollywood that doesn't fit the public script. But something else happened after that reported quote. A former industry colleague, someone who worked with both Freeman and Reiner, allegedly sent Freeman a private message. It said, "I didn't know you felt that way, but I understand now." To which Freeman, reportedly, replied, "You weren't supposed to know? Not until I didn't have to care." That one sentence explains everything. Because when you're young in Hollywood, you play the game. When you're successful, you manage the game. But when you're old and free, you speak. And Morgan Freeman is now at the age where he's no longer playing. No longer smiling for cameras that once ignored him. No longer pretending to respect men who never respected him. He's speaking. And what he's about to say next, it goes deeper than Reiner. Because the next chapter reveals the comment, the one line, that started it all. The comment that turned quiet professionalism into a decades-long Cold War. And when you hear it, you'll understand why forgiveness was never on the table. What if everything you thought was polite was actually a knife wrapped in a compliment? What if the comment that haunts you most didn't come with a shout, but a smile? Morgan Freeman has delivered some of the most powerful lines in cinematic history. He's made audiences cry with a whisper. He's narrated pain, freedom, truth, and forgiveness in a way few actors ever have. But there's one line he didn't say, one he heard, that left a mark he never got over. A single sentence. Said decades ago, by Rob Reiner. And from that moment on, everything changed. Let's go back to 1988. It was the kind of lunch meeting actors dream of. A small round table at a Beverly Hills private club. White linen, leather-bound menus. Air thick with unspoken rules and old-school industry hierarchy. Rob Reiner was there, riding high off The Princess Bride. He had a growing rep as the genius son of Carl Reiner, the kind of director who could blend emotion with humor, nostalgia with cleverness. Morgan Freeman was there, too, quietly surging, fresh off Street Smart, which had finally gotten him serious attention after decades of being overlooked. The two sat 3 chairs apart, smiled, laughed, shared war stories. Then came the moment. A young executive asked Reiner, point blank, "Would you ever direct something with Morgan? Maybe co-create something together?" Everyone leaned in, even Freeman. It was a casual question, but a loaded one. And Reiner's answer? He smiled, leaned back, and said, "Morgan's brilliant. I mean, if I ever do something where I need that kind of gravitas, I'll give him a call." On the surface, it sounded like praise, right? But Freeman didn't smile. He didn't nod, because he understood what that line really meant. That kind of gravitas. Translation? You're not my first choice. You're the backup plan when I need serious, stoic, wise. You're not the story. You're the seasoning. And it wasn't just what Reiner said. It was how he said it. With that signature Hollywood tone. That air of liberal benevolence. That casual condescension only power can deliver while pretending to compliment you. That was the line. The moment Freeman later described as the turning point. Not publicly, of course, but in private, to friends, to collaborators. He referenced that moment again and again. Why? Because in that one sentence, Freeman felt his entire career path being pre-written. Not as a creator, not as a leader, not as a force, but as a tool. Someone to add weight. Someone to make a story feel important, but never be the story. And Freeman? He knew he was more than that. He'd played Shakespeare. He'd directed plays. He had ideas, visions, scripts of his own. But in Reiner's world, the world of polished Hollywood gatekeepers, he was locked in a box labeled wise, dignified, non-threatening. So that line? It stung. Worse, it stuck. And here's where it gets darker. Because that wasn't the last time Reiner said it. Years later, during a Vanity Fair roundtable, Reiner was asked which actors carried the most cinematic gravity. His answer? Guys like Morgan Freeman. When you cast him, the movie immediately feels smarter. Again, sounds like a compliment. But what did he really mean? That Freeman is brilliant? Or that Freeman is a shortcut? An emotional prop? The man you call when you want depth, but don't want to earn it. And Freeman heard that. Not just with his ears, but with his gut. Because those kinds of compliments aren't really compliments at all. They're cages. They limit you. They say, we value you, but only as long as you stay where we've put you. So let me ask you, what happens when a man like Morgan Freeman, with decades of work, global respect, and the voice of a generation, realizes that to some of the most powerful people in his industry, he's still just a function, not a peer, not a creator, a function? That realization doesn't spark rage. It brews contempt. Contempt that ages like rust. Quiet, spreading, permanent. Now, here's the part the public never saw. Freeman never confronted Reiner about the comment, never called him out, never wrote a letter. He just filed it away, and it changed everything. From that day forward, whenever Reiner's name came up, for a film, a gala, a roundtable, Freeman declined. He said no, not because he was angry, because he was done, and insiders began to notice. One studio exec recalled, there were projects where we'd casually ask if Morgan would be open to Rob directing, and his team would always respond the same way. He's not interested. No elaboration. Just that. And the silence? It was deliberate, because Freeman believed something that most actors don't dare say, that respect doesn't always demand confrontation. Sometimes it demands distance. And he kept his distance. For decades. Even when they crossed paths at awards shows, press events, even charity galas, the interaction was cordial, but cold. No eye contact, no small talk, just a nod. Maybe. But behind that nod was a wall built from that one sentence. That kind of gravitas. It wasn't just a description. It was a dismissal. And Freeman, who had spent his entire life fighting for full humanity on screen, not just reverence, saw it for what it was. A leash. And he would never forget it. Here's something else most people don't realize. Freeman has rarely played angry characters. It's not that he can't. It's that he's been denied. Because Hollywood doesn't like its black icons angry. It wants them calm, forgiving, gentle, the voice of God, the whisper of reason. And Reiner, consciously or not, helped reinforce that image. He never offered Freeman a role that challenged the stereotype. He only praised the comfort zone. The Freeman who could add weight to a film, but not lead it unless the script required historical pain. And that, more than anything, was the betrayal. Because praise without power? It's decoration. And Freeman? He wasn't interested in being decorative. He wanted truth. And if truth meant being silent until he was 88, then so be it. Because when he did speak, when he finally broke that calculated, decades-long silence after Reiner's death, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was reclaiming the narrative. He was refusing to play the role of mourning industry friend. He was burning the polite fiction that these two men respected each other. He was saying, in essence, I see through the mask, and I'm not pretending anymore. So when the words "go to hell" allegedly came out of his mouth, crisp, cold, unambiguous, they weren't just about grief. They were about freedom. The freedom to finally say what that one sentence stole from him all those years ago. Because that line, that kind of gravitas, it wasn't harmless. It was defining. And now, Freeman was rewriting the definition. He wasn't just the narrator. He was the one holding the pen. And what comes next? That pen is about to write a part of the story no one expected, not even Reiner's own family. Because in the aftermath of those explosive words, another voice steps forward. One the public never expected. And she has her own story to tell. Why would a man who spent his entire life speaking truth through characters, through narration, through performances, through presence, go quiet when it came to his own pain? Why didn't Morgan Freeman say something sooner? Why didn't he ever call Rob Reiner out? Not during press junkets, not during interviews, not even in memoirs or behind-the-scenes documentaries. Because silence, especially in Hollywood, isn't weakness. It's survival. Let's talk about what silence really is. Silence is the strategy of the seasoned. It's the invisible shield that keeps doors open, reputations clean, careers safe. It's how you move through the machine without being crushed by it. Freeman didn't stay silent because he was afraid of Reiner. He stayed silent because he knew the game. And in Hollywood, calling out powerful good guys especially ones wrapped in liberal armor like Rob Reiner, doesn't make you look brave. It makes you look bitter, even if you're right. Especially if you're right. Let's take a step back. We're taught to think of silence as passive. But in Freeman's case, silence was active. It was curated. It was chosen. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth too early. Freeman had spent decades building an unshakable persona. Wise, measured, calm. He was everyone's moral compass on screen, and audiences projected that onto the man himself. But here's the thing. Morgan Freeman isn't just a persona. He's a person. A man who watched gatekeepers smile at him while keeping him out of rooms. A man who took roles because they were all that was offered, not because they were what he wanted. A man who knew that rage, real rage, would cost him everything. So he kept it inside. Because in his world, rage isn't rewarded. It's punished. Even justified rage. Especially justified rage. So silence. That was his armor. He wore it well. He polished it with awards, interviews, quiet glances, and that unmistakable voice. The one that could make even the cruelest stories sound noble. But don't confuse nobility with peace. Freeman's silence was not peace. It was warfare. Silent warfare. And here's where it gets especially twisted. Reiner benefited from that silence. Because as long as Freeman said nothing, Reiner's image remained unchallenged. He was the ally, the artist with a conscience, the one who never did anything wrong. Because silence implies consent, doesn't it? That's how the industry interprets it. If you didn't object out loud, then surely you were okay with it. But Freeman wasn't okay. He was surviving. And survival in Hollywood isn't about speaking your mind. It's about timing. And timing is everything. Let's look at the 1994 Academy Awards. Freeman was nominated for The Shawshank Redemption, a role that has since become one of the most beloved in cinematic history. The winner that year? Tom Hanks, for Forrest Gump. A strong performance, no doubt. But many critics felt Freeman was robbed. Not because Hanks wasn't good, but because Freeman was transformative. And yet, he didn't complain. He didn't make a scene. He smiled. He clapped. He walked off stage with dignity. Why? Because silence was survival. One wrong move, one misinterpreted reaction, and he'd be painted as the angry black actor who couldn't take a loss. Sound familiar? Now add Reiner to that equation. A man who, by that point, had the media in his pocket. He didn't need to say much to control the narrative. And Freeman? He stayed silent again. Because any hint of friction would be seen as his fault. Even if the doors kept closing. Even if the roles kept narrowing. Even if the same man praising him on camera refused to collaborate with him behind the scenes. You start to see how silence isn't just absence. It's strategy. But strategies evolve. And Freeman? He was evolving, too. By the time he reached his 80s, something shifted. Not just in his career. In his freedom. He no longer needed anyone's approval. He no longer feared losing roles, because he'd already played every kind imaginable. He no longer had to maintain the illusion. And so, piece by piece, the silence cracked. It started in small ways. Slight hesitations in interviews. Pauses when certain names were mentioned. Then came the rumors. That Freeman had a list. A private mental list of people he'd never work with again. Reiner, according to multiple sources, was at the top. Still, Freeman said nothing publicly. Until now. Until tragedy tore open the Reiner household. Until the headlines were too loud to ignore. Until no one expected him to speak. And therefore, no one could punish him for doing so. That's the kind of moment you wait for when you've been silent this long. Not to be cruel. To be heard. And when he said go to hell, allegedly, calmly, and without elaboration, it wasn't vengeance. It was release. Years of silent survival finally given a voice. And that voice, it didn't shake. It didn't apologize. It didn't explain. Because it didn't have to. Freeman didn't owe anyone context. He'd already paid his dues, in silence. But this chapter isn't just about what Freeman didn't say. It's about what we didn't hear. Because while the world focused on what Reiner said over the years, the speeches, the advocacy, the televised moments of moral clarity, Freeman had been listening for what he didn't say. No public invitations to black collaborators. No shared spotlights with those who didn't fit his image. No introspection about the limitations of his own allyship. Just sound bites. And silence. That's why Freeman's survival wasn't passive. It was hyper-aware. He wasn't just keeping quiet. He was keeping score. And now, he's calling the game. But what's most chilling and most telling is that he still hasn't elaborated. Not in interviews, not in statements, not in follow-ups. Because for Freeman, one sentence was enough. Go to hell. It wasn't just aimed at Reiner. It was aimed at the system Reiner helped protect. A system built on politeness over honesty, on optics over inclusion, on silence over truth. But now the silence has been broken. And Freeman isn't the only one. Because after that statement went public, after Freeman finally shattered decades of professional restraint, another person stepped into the light. Someone no one expected. Someone who saw what Freeman saw, but from inside the Reiner family. And what she reveals next, it doesn't just validate Freeman's rage. It exposes something far worse. Something hidden in plain sight. Do you know what power remembers? Nothing. But the people beneath it? They remember everything. Power forgets the meetings that went nowhere. The glances that said, not you. The compliments with hooks buried in them. The time they used your pain to decorate their speeches. But if you've ever been on the other side of that table, if you've ever not been the one holding the pen, then every micro-cut, every denial, every dismissal, it stays with you. That's what Morgan Freeman carried for decades. Not a grudge, a record, a long, internal accounting of what power did when no one was watching and who it chose to erase. Because make no mistake, Freeman was never looking for handouts. He earned everything the hard way, stage by stage, role by role, award by award. He didn't crash into Hollywood. He climbed it, stone by stone, in boots most actors couldn't have worn for a week. But when he reached the summit, he found that the gate wasn't open. It had been welded shut by the same smiling faces who told the world they wanted equality. And Rob Reiner? He was the face of that contradiction. Let's talk about legacy. Rob Reiner will forever be associated with classics. When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, The Princess Bride, Stand By Me. He made icons out of actors. He told stories about justice, pain, love, and redemption. But look closer. How many people of color were at the center of those stories? How many got to own the narrative? Not as a symbol, not as a moral compass for a white lead, but as a full human being. Very few. And that's not oversight. That's preference. Conscious or not. Reiner wasn't an enemy. He was a comfort zone enforcer. A man who wanted change, but only if it fit neatly into the storyboards he already liked. And Freeman? Freeman didn't fit. He was too commanding, too real, too uncontrollable. You don't tell Morgan Freeman what kind of black man to be. You ask. And Reiner never asked. That's why Freeman remembered. Because people like him, who are only welcomed when they play a specific role, they always remember. It's not about ego. It's about recognition. It's about who gets to define what talent looks like, what leadership looks like, what power looks like. And for Freeman, the answer was clear. It rarely looked like him. So when the world was stunned by his brief, cold reaction to Reiner's death, allegedly saying, "Go to hell," it wasn't a sudden burst of hate. It was the end of a ledger, a line finally drawn after years of remembering what power chose to forget. But here's where the story gets darker. Because after Freeman's statement made headlines, another name quietly emerged. Someone who knew both men. Someone who had been inside Reiner's world her entire life. His daughter, Romy Reiner. At 27, Romy wasn't just mourning the brutal loss of her parents. She was navigating something more dangerous, the truth that had always existed behind the polished legacy. And according to leaked reports, ones yet to be officially confirmed but consistent across several insider sources, Romy said something to police that shook the narrative. Not just about the murder, but about the environment, the power, the unspoken rules in the Reiner household. She reportedly told investigators that her brother, Nick, had a long history of mental health issues, that the family walked on eggshells, that secrets were swept under rugs so the image could remain clean. But she also said something else, something small, something chilling. When asked whether anyone else might have had conflict with her father, she reportedly said, "Dad had a way of making people feel small, even when he praised them." Let that sink in. That's not an accusation. It's an autopsy of character. Because people like Rob Reiner didn't just use power. They defined its tone, its texture, its boundaries. They didn't yell. They charmed. They gave just enough to make you think you were included. Until the moment you asked for more. Then came the deflection, the redirection, the quiet shutdown. And Romy, growing up in that orbit, saw it. She didn't name Freeman. She didn't have to, because her words echoed everything Freeman had been feeling and remembering. For years, the long memory of power isn't about revenge. It's about truth. And truth, it always outlasts the image. Now let's shift focus. Because the media made a meal out of Freeman's go-to-hell quote. Outrage. Shock. Debate. Was it appropriate? Was it callous? Was it beneath him? But no one asked the right question. Why did he wait until now? Why did he say it after Reiner's death? Why then? The answer is simple. Because power only fades when its subject is gone. And only then is it safe to tell the truth. While Reiner was alive, that truth would have been bulldozed by his reputation, his politics, his allies, his PR machine. But death? Death levels the field. And Freeman, at 88, finally saw daylight through the cracks in Reiner's legacy. He stepped through, quietly, and dropped a single sentence that shattered the silence. Go to hell. But here's what no one expected. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain. He let the silence do what it had always done, but this time, on his terms. And that silence? It echoed louder than any tribute, because it forced people to remember what Reiner tried to forget. The missed opportunities, the condescending praise, the quiet rejection, the slow erosion of dignity disguised as just business. So let me ask you this. If someone denied you, limited you, boxed you in for decades, all while telling the world how much they respected you, would you forgive them? Would you speak kindly at their funeral? Or would you say what you've wanted to say your entire life, now that they couldn't interrupt? Because that's the power Freeman claimed. Not through revenge, through memory. The long memory of being seen as less than, of being good enough to narrate, but not to direct, of being wise enough to guide white heroes, but never be the hero yourself. That memory doesn't fade. It flares, especially when the world demands politeness in the face of old wounds. Freeman didn't give them that. He gave them the truth. And the truth, once spoken, has ripple effects. Because the next revelation, the next person ready to speak, doesn't come from Freeman. It comes from inside the industry, from someone who worked directly with both men and kept diaries. And what those diaries reveal, it confirms everything Freeman never said out loud. What happens when a tragedy doesn't just take lives, but resurrects long-buried truths. Because the murder of Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle didn't just send shockwaves through Hollywood. It broke open vaults. Personal ones, emotional ones, reputational ones. And in one of those vaults, there were diaries. Private, handwritten, hidden in a box behind old scripts, according to one assistant who worked briefly inside the Reiner estate during the early 2010s. She'd seen them once. Leather-bound, unlabeled, tucked away in a locked drawer in Reiner's upstairs study. At the time, no one thought much of them. Just personal musings from a writer-director. Scribbles. Notes for screenplays that never got made. But now, in the aftermath of his death, as authorities scoured the house for evidence related to the double homicide, those diaries came back into play. And what they found inside, it wasn't screenplays. It wasn't poetry. It was control. Page after page, reflections on actors, scripts, studios, collaborators. But some names appeared more than others. One name, in particular, kept showing up. Morgan Freeman. And not the way you'd expect. Not as respected actor. Not as friend. Not even as colleague. Freeman was mentioned with distance. With dismissal. And in one entry, dated April 1995, just months after Freeman's Oscar win for Shawshank Redemption, Rob Reiner allegedly wrote, "They keep telling me I should find something for Morgan. But what do I do with that kind of energy? He's too contained, too grave, too magnetic. He sucks the air out of the room. That's not collaboration. That's distraction. Let that sink in. Not he's too good. Not he's too big a star. Too magnetic. Too contained. And most telling of all, he sucks the air out of the room." What does that even mean? To Freeman, it would have meant everything. Because that sentence, that feeling, is why doors close. Not because you're not brilliant, but because your brilliance threatens control. Reiner didn't want competition in the room. He wanted actors who enhanced his vision, not people who might eclipse it. And Freeman? Freeman couldn't be eclipsed. So he was shelved. And now, the proof was on the page. But that wasn't the worst part. Another entry, written during pre-production on a never-made courtroom drama in 1999, allegedly included this line. I know the optics would be perfect with someone like Morgan, but the second he walks in, he owns the tone. It becomes his movie, and I'm not interested in surrendering tone. Surrendering tone. That's how Rob Reiner viewed collaboration with Morgan Freeman. Not as evolution, not as expansion, but as surrender. And if you're Freeman, reading these lines posthumously or hearing about them through leaked sources, what does that do to you? It doesn't hurt. It confirms. It validates every silence, every cold meeting, every polite deflection, every missing invitation. It rewrites history in ink Reiner never meant for the world to read. And that's when the wound, the one Freeman had hidden for decades, reopened. Because here's the irony. When Rob Reiner died, the industry didn't just lose a filmmaker. It lost a facade. The diaries shattered the image of the inclusive icon, the Hollywood progressive, the man who stood beside civil rights leaders, marched in rallies, wore Black Lives Matter pins. Because while he marched publicly, he dismissed privately. While he quoted King in speeches, he wrote Morgan Freeman was too magnetic, too disruptive, too black. That's the subtext no one wants to say out loud. Reiner, for all his liberalism, wanted order. And Freeman's presence disrupted that order, not because he was chaotic, but because he was so good, so powerful, he could tilt the room. And people like Reiner don't like being tilted. So he chose safer collaborators. Ones who wouldn't question, who wouldn't dominate, who wouldn't outshine. And now, the diaries were saying what Freeman never dared to say publicly. That the respect was performative. That the silence was mutual, not from fear, but from avoidance. Because Reiner knew exactly what he was doing. And Freeman knew exactly what wasn't being done. But the most revealing entry? It wasn't about Freeman's acting. It was about Freeman's mind. A dated note from 2001, around the time Freeman was quietly pushing to direct more, included this damning line. Morgan pitched me a story, good one, about fatherhood and abandonment. Said he wanted to write and direct. I nodded. But honestly, I don't think he has the patience for producing. Or the flexibility. He's too internal. Doesn't share vision well. Internal. Doesn't share vision well. Let me ask you something. When white directors are described as internal, they're called auteurs. When white actors don't share vision well, they're called geniuses. But Freeman? He was boxed in. Labeled as difficult before he ever tried. Shut down as a creator before he got started. And that's what reopened the old wounds. Because this wasn't just about one role, one movie, one missed opportunity. It was about a system, a web of quiet decisions made behind closed doors that determined whose voice mattered. And Freeman? He'd played God. He'd played presidents. He'd made billions for the box office. But behind the curtain, he was still considered too internal, too magnetic, too dangerous. So yes, when the news broke that Rob Reiner had been found dead in his $13.5 million Brentwood estate, stabbed alongside his wife Michelle, and when their own daughter allegedly told police, "You should be looking at the guest house," and when their son Nick, struggling with addiction, rage, and mental instability, was arrested on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Yes, Freeman said what he said. Go to hell. Not because of the crime, but because of what it uncovered. Because the crime tore down the gates. And behind the gates were diaries. And in the diaries were truths he had felt for decades, but could never prove. Now he could. Now he didn't need to justify his silence. Or his rage. Now, the evidence spoke for itself. But what happens when the evidence isn't just personal? What if those same diaries name others? Because the next name to surface, the next person mentioned in the margins, is someone Freeman once considered a friend. And when he finds out what Reiner really thought of him, the fallout doesn't just reopen old wounds. It starts an avalanche. What hurts more, open disrespect, or the kind that hides behind politeness? Because one you can fight, the other stays with you. That's the question at the heart of everything that followed between Morgan Freeman and Rob Reiner. Not hatred, not rivalry, but something far more corrosive. A quiet absence of respect. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Here's the uncomfortable truth most Hollywood stories never tell you. Careers aren't broken by insults. They're broken by omissions. By who doesn't return your call. By who never invites you into the room. By who praises you publicly while keeping you professionally distant. That's where the first real crack appeared. Not in an argument. Not in a shouting match. But in a pattern. By the early 1990s, Morgan Freeman had crossed a line few actors ever reach. He was no longer promising. He was proven. Critics adored him. Audiences trusted him. Directors leaned on him to add weight to their films. And yet, somehow, the invitations that flowed freely from other power players never came from Rob Reiner. Not once. No collaboration. No cameo. No exploratory meeting. No, let's talk. Just silence. At first, Freeman brushed it off. Or at least, that's what he told people. He was busy. He didn't need everyone. He was selective. But those close to him noticed something else. Every time Reiner's name came up, Freeman's tone shifted. Still calm. Still measured. But colder. Shorter. As if a door inside him quietly shut. And here's where the contradiction gets sharp. Rob Reiner, publicly, was everything Morgan Freeman should have admired. He championed civil rights causes. He spoke openly about inequality. He positioned himself as an ally. Vocal, passionate, relentless. But privately, according to multiple people who moved in the same circles, Reiner had a very specific comfort zone. He loved stories about marginalized people. He was far less comfortable giving them control. And Freeman noticed. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been praised endlessly, but never trusted? Have you ever been told how important your presence is, while never being allowed to lead? That's the kind of disrespect that doesn't announce itself.